Now I'm going to hit record.
Right, okay. Oh, right. Good morning, folks. It's good to catch up with you all again. I'm Dave Leighton Scott. I'm here to do a prevent. It's not refresher training because you're all prevent aware. So I'm not going to go through what prevent is for you. I'm going to go through what are the topics, what are the concerns at the moment. And I've got to say, there isn't anything radically new because I take this information from the counter-terrorism local profile and talk to the police and other partners, but there is a change of emphasis and a reinforce some of our concerns for you this morning. I've got the chat bar open, so if you want to type a question as we go along, please do. That's not a problem. You know, the more you all know each other, we can ask questions in confidence. There probably will be a couple of minutes at the end anyway, but if you want, I know sometimes it's better to ask a question while we're discussing the subject, so we keep the context rather than wait until the end. So please feel free just to type in a question, or if you want to verbalise it, just put your hand up and we'll come over through it to you. So please be as interactive as you want on this. So that's the introduction. Let's crack on. Okay, so this is where we are in 2022. It's been a strange year, a couple of years, isn't it? You know, when we tried to put when you talk about anything now and you talk to people, it's like when was the last time I was there, or we used to do this in person? We talk about pre-C, don't we, before COVID and things like this now, and it's trying to put those things in question and how the landscape has been changed, and certainly with the news environment over the last year or two, and even recently, certainly topics like prevent have dropped into the background. There is a prevent review ongoing, which I probably mentioned even the last time we spoke, which is still ongoing, because every time we talk to our Home Secretary or a Home Secretary looks at it, somehow there's a new Home Secretary who wants to suddenly have a look at it again. So we're in that situation. 2 weeks ago, the last Home Secretary was talking about the prevent review would be a priority. She's not there now. We've got a new Home Secretary. It will change. It does change things. You know, these things, I know people talk about, you know, this is great for those who are interested in politics and watching the shenanigans. But what I've got to say, what in effect, what the government's really been like since the summer is it's effectively been in purdah, in that it's been very hard to move new things on. And the prevent review is one of those. So, you know, there are not a lot of us, but there are a few of us who work in this domain, but it does have that outward impact. And how prevent is really done. In all honesty, the prevent review is making some big recommendations about how prevent is done and what it should focus on. You know, and should it focus be, for example, should it be driven just on around ideologies, or should it look at the wider issues? And we'll be discussing those issues today. But just bear in mind, over the next 6 months, there could be some changes about how and what prevent is. It will be in the media, but, you know, Daniel will be getting updates, and, you know, we can always come back and speak. But it's been a very strange time for those of us working in government. I'm not about the politics side of it. Those of us who are actually working in government, civil servants. You've got a guest. Do you want me to admit? Is that Danny?
It's okay. I can do that. I'll keep an eye on the chat
it's okay. I wasn't
well.
sure. Yeah. So as with a lot of government things, it's a little bit up in the air. So we shall see how it goes. But anyway, these parts are ongoing now, and they would stay ongoing, because these parts are assessed by primarily by the police and other agencies who are working in this. So it's assessed that a terrorist attack would come from a self-initiated terrorist, and the terrorist. And at the moment, we sit up substantial. And that's the terror threat level. That's between 1 and 5. We're sitting at level 3. It sounds good, and it is good because it's dropped earlier on in the year. But what it tells us is the terrorist attack is still thought to be likely. And again, you know, it's hard to kind of keep reinforcing this. And I know colleagues and my ex-colleagues in the police and other agencies saying, look, on pages 6 or 7 or 8 of newspapers all over the last couple of years, there's been arrests being shown, and we'll talk about some of those figures. These are ongoing issues. There's just been such a big change in the news cycle, and I sat and I spend a lot of time up in Scotland. I was in Scotland at the weekend just reading a local paper, and it was talking about 2 terrorist offences which had gone to the Old Bailey last week. You know, these things are occurring. So we need to be aware the terrorist threat is still likely. If the terrorist threat is still likely, what that indicates to us is that those who are trying to recruit, groom and radicalise those vulnerable individuals who we may be working for are still busy as well. You know, this issue hasn't gone away. What self-initiated terrorism is telling us, though, and this has been the case over the last couple of years, this is the method of attack. So when you hear a government, if you do hear somebody at the Home Office or senior police officer talk about self-initiated terrorist, this is the mode of attack. This is the current, and it has been for the last 4 or 5 years, really, somebody going out and acting on their own, either using a knife, bladed instrument, car, not so often in this country, but sometimes abroad, a gun. But they go out and they act on their own. And this is reinforced if you just jump down to the last one, the use of online platforms, including social media, etc. I know we've spoke over the last couple of years, you're all aware that the internet was changing things. And certainly over the last 2 to 3 years, there is that concern. And I think we can pretty much say now about how the internet across all its forms, you know, everything from very easy to reach kind of social media to the darker web to encrypted things, but even on things like gaming and all these things, they're all targeted by various groups who are trying to radicalize people. We know, you know, we've talked about safeguarding over the last couple of years, and you work with vulnerable individuals, and often we know how much more time people are spending online. We know the risks around all forms of safeguarding, and that was repeatedly highlighted through the pandemic. And that concern was, as we come out of the pandemic, some of those habits would be, you know, around sexual exploitation online, county lines work online. We know all these individuals and groups doing these, all targeting people online. You know, so we know that continues. And certainly, the biggest change in our, certainly in my lifetime, is how people are radicalised. And I've said it before, in the 70s, you wouldn't be able to radicalise. Half these people have been radicalised, even more than that, wouldn't have been radicalised previously. The internet is a fantastic thing, but it facilitates lots of things. And increased use of the internet over the last 2 to 3 years, and its continual increased use, has opened those vulnerabilities more to people. So I know we all do a lot of work around online safety in general, and whenever we're doing that type of work, we need to discuss with students and colleagues the dangers of being drawn into some murky world around this. But self-initiated terrorists, these individuals going out acting on their own, they feel part of global organisations. So when you see these people, and we'll look at a couple of examples in a minute, where they go out and they commit horrific acts of murder, they're then claimed by global terrorist groups or as part of them. They've never met these people. They may have met 1 or 2 individuals online in organisations. Very often they're just drawing ideology lines, talking to others about that online, and then picking up when people are saying, well, why don't you go and do something about it, or being encouraged. So self-initiated terrorists is what we used to refer to as lone actors, but it's how it works more. Self-initiated describes it better. And when you look at the terrorist attacks over the last 4 to 5 years, the vast majority have been individuals going out committing random acts of horrific violence on their own. Sometimes either ending their own lives, getting shot, sometimes being caught, but then being claimed by international terror groups as part of their movement. Even if they've never, ever been connected to them, they support that ideology. So that's threat. The 2 main threats still remain the same as they have been, and I'll cover them a little bit more in a minute. The main threat from Islamist terrorism, it remains present across the region, and I'll cover a little bit more about that in a minute, and is continued from the extreme far right, which I know we've done the work about the different types of ideologies, but that stays the same. So actually we'll move on. We'll look at both those issues and where they stand at the moment. So Islamist terrorism, and just remind people what this is. These are acts of terrorism perpetrated or inspired by politically or religiously motivated groups or individuals who support and use violence to violence as a means to establish their interpretation, and it's their individual interpretation of an Islamic state or caliphate. Okay, that's what it is. It's not an issue around a faith. It's about people who are willing to use violence, because that's what Prevent is. You remember when we talk about Prevent, it challenges ideologies. It challenges any ideology where there is talk about using violence to change in a democratic society where we live. Okay, so it's those small individuals who will use a corrupted version of a faith to use violence. In this case, it is a global issue. It's one of those where it is a global issue. So wherever that caliphate may be, they are encouraged to use violence for. We know it was a clear example of about 5 or 6 years now, when, you know, there was issues in Syria, and we saw those vulnerable people being drawn out to Syria. And we still see issues around that, don't we? About some of those young women wanting to come back in some cases, those concerns about how they were manipulated, in essence, kind of groomed to go out there, those issues. But what's happened in the years following that, where that kind of the idea of a caliphate fell, but those groups, and we're talking about what we were really talking about, the followers of ISIS, Daesh, Al-Qaeda, they've told their followers, look, this war, in their mind, this war against the global West, as they portray it, the great enemy, continues. And you can go out and you can commit random acts of violence in your homeland. That's what we are expecting you to do now. And this fits in with this self-initiated phase where they carry on. And over the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen those acts occur, and they will continue to occur. And when you look at newspapers, and that's what I say, if you Google terrorist arrests in the UK, you'd be surprised. They're still occurring. They're not the major news stories they are, but they are there, and we're seeing individuals being arrested for both supporting Islamist terrorism and extreme far right, which I'll cover in a minute. We're seeing those arrests being made for various issues, and I've highlighted one just down the bottom, just taken off the information that the police share with us every now and again. It's in the news, and this isn't secret, but when they do their CTLPs, they highlight regional issues, and they've just highlighted one. You know, a young lad called Matthew King. He's only 18 when he was arrested. So he's probably 17, he's probably a child when he first started looking at these things. He's been drawn into the world of Islamism, and he's been encouraged. And what he's been found to be doing, because the police, I've said it before, I make no apologies, we have some of the best anti-terrorism networks in the world. Obviously, somehow they've cottoned on to what he's doing, and he's been filmed surveying or carrying out surveillance of police buildings and other places. He's been arrested, and he's now on remand. He'll probably go to court at some point next year, and sadly, he'll probably get convicted. So somehow we've missed that young lad. Was there signs before he got to that stage? As very often the case. What have we done? Have we let Matthew down? Were there signs? Because he probably is still in some form of education, or was in some form of education. And this is the thing where I keep reminding people now. Yeah, we see terrorist arrests of all ages, but we're seeing more and more of a younger demographic, and that's reinforced when we talk about the far right in a couple of minutes to bring that home. But Matthew was only 18. So he was a child when some of this was going on. What were the signs? Were there signs? Were there something that was showing that actually somebody was grooming, radicalising him and taking him down this path? What did we miss? So there is that message. But I also use this part of it just to discuss this continued issue. And I know Danny and people have discussed it. What, you know, I've been doing this now for almost 15 years in different roles, and people still ask me, what do terrorists look like? You know, and there is still this common thread. We watch all these kind of, from everything from James Bond movies to some of these issues you see on Prime and all that, where terrorists also appear to be ultra well-trained individuals of, you know, they just look military-like. They're ready. They can kill with a, you know, using a matchbox or whatever. They're all trained, and they're not. They're people from our communities who are being drawn in. Young Matthew has probably just looked like everybody else. But this picture here is what I used to emphasise this at the moment. That there is Ali Habdi Ali. He looks like, and he is, he's just a member of our communities. But he's on his way there, according to the media, and I've got no reason to doubt this picture comes from open source media. He's passing that officer who's going to get on a train. He's going to go down to Southend and he's going to kill an MP. He's going to murder Sir David Amess in a terrorist attack. So what does a terrorist look like? It looks like him. You know, this idea that there is some special breed, you know, or they all look different, or there was something glamorous. That's Ali Habdi Ali on his way to commit a terrorist attack. Almost over a year now, wasn't it? It was the anniversary a couple of weekends ago down in Southend. And this was a young man, really, still in his early 20s, who'd been drawn into this Islamic terrorism world. He'd been studying, you know, he'd been looking up. He was living in London. How do I go? Where can I go and commit an attack? And he just convinced himself that London was too securitized, that MPs, the Houses of Parliament, and all those areas, he wouldn't get the opportunity. Because you probably see, because we see more of white on the television than we do anything else at the moment. You see all the barriers, there's always the police, and he just figured out, this won't work, but I want to attack an MP. And sadly, there is a history of that with Stephen Timms, the MP who was attacked, Joe Cox, who was murdered by a far right terrorist, and he'd kind of looked at that and sadly figured out that Sir David Amess at his kind of political surgery at a church down in Southend would be that target, and that's him on his way. And as we see there, just passing the police officer, oh, what do you know? No, he's totally not known to anybody. He is one that had come up and nobody was aware. The establishment, all the figures weren't aware of him, but it transpires he'd been planning this type of thing for quite a while. So when we talk about terrorism, what's it look like? I keep reminding people, it's vulnerable people in our communities who are exploited globally by people. It's not people who are imported. It's not a James Bond movie. He's not connected to Spectre, that man, but he's going to go and commit a horrific terrorist attack. So what do terrorists look like? They look like any of us, any in your group or anybody you know, because that's where we come from. They come from our communities. So, okay, just if we talk about the extreme right-wing terrorism attack is, yeah, slightly different. It's an extreme is considered a possibility where it never used to be. Now, I know we've talked about this and we've done training about the 3 different types and the classification, so I'm not here to do that today. But what I am going to remind you of really is that this was a new threat. Up to 3 or 4 years ago, that a consideration of attack from an extreme right wing, somebody for an extreme right wing ideology wasn't considered. It wasn't put into the terrorist threat level. It is now, and I'm sure it's going to stay like that. You know, there's nothing to intimate that's going to change. And it's as I've said at previous meetings, and as we say now, there are, you know, we see a high proportion of prevent referrals come into channel panels, which I know you appreciate, the multi-agency panel who try to deal with this. We see more of those now than we do around Islamism. You know, and as for those of you who hadn't spoken before, I've been doing this, like I say, for a long time. 8 or 9 years ago, probably 1 in 8, 1 in 9 prevent referrals was around the far right, very often linked to kind of people with the EDL type mindset. Not the EDL was a far right organisation, but there was those type of concerns. You know, we are seeing referrals now relating to people, young people, you know, and I'm talking about a young demographic, and that's really noticeable about the extreme far right, the amount of young people being involved who we're dealing with this, who are being drawn into what we would refer to as white supremacist, neo-Nazi style ideology. That type of ideology at its core has a belief that violence is acceptable to use to fight back. It's one of the differences from kind of white nationalist groups and cultural nationalist groups who share an ugly narrative around some of the politics of this on the far right, and that's what makes it hard to kind of sometimes break down. But when you get to that white supremacist neo-Nazi kind of end, it says, well, we can use violence and we should be using violence, and we're going to encourage. And they've gone out that way over the last 2 to 3 years, well, over the last decade, and we saw that 4 or 5 years ago coming to the fore more on social media, and that's what we've spoke about before. And hence, for the last 3 years, I've said, yeah, and the terrorist attack is extremely likely. So, as you can see there, referrals around the extreme far right continue to outnumber those, and it's noticeable about the ages that they are very often very young. So, yeah, you know, this is a national issue. It continues to be an issue. We've seen it all over the Eastern region. We've just got a couple of examples there. We've seen a 17-year-old arrested in Hertfordshire recently. So he's 17, he's still in education. You know, and he was very low risk, this young man, because he's been on bail. That's extremely rare, and I'll talk about arrests. I may have done that before, but I just want to kind of reinforce some of that. That's extremely rare. We do get, you know, people are vulnerable at any age, and we've seen a 45-year-old male arrested in Suffolk. So there is an age range, although there's a tendency for it to be younger. And we've seen some arrested in Norwich, and possibly, I think those were in their late teens, early 20s at the most. But what I want to highlight here, though, is this effort, this thought process of those extremist views now, they have turned towards these kind of the idea of self-initiated terrorism. It wasn't back in the day, 10, 15 years ago, they weren't a terrorist threat, and they wouldn't discuss, they weren't trying to do that. They liked the rallies, and we've got pictures there. The background is that from the old National Action rally before they were banned. There's some of it on the television. Some of you, the walk-in, some of you may have watched that, which is an example of this. The walk-in is based on the National Action issue. You know, if somebody goes to Hope Not Hate and says, look, this group, they're going to murder somebody. And it's based on fact, and it's based on national action. And from previous training or previous sessions, you're probably aware, national action, because of what was happening, and those who have seen the walk-in know how it worked, it transpires that this group of people were planning to murder MPs. Those group of people weren't some 35, 40-year-old shadowy organisation globally. They were groups of young men in communities around this country who were connected up online, were doing turning up at Unite the Right rallies as part of the National Action demographic, looking very aggressive, masked up, purporting and pushing this violent action, supporting Tommy Mayer who'd murdered Joe Cox. And as the walk-in kind of describes, one of them steps out, goes to Hope Not Hate, the racist anti-racist charity, and says they're going to kill somebody. And it led to senior members of that organisation. Why should we talk about senior members? We're talking about people in their mid-20s. Again, this wasn't some kind of shadowy government-run, or this was a group of young people online, but they were going to murder people. People are doing life sentences for that. And it was around that time when that happened, and it's really based partly on that. But the Home Office and group said, we've got to now put this. This is going to lead to some type of action. I would suggest we've been fortunate it hasn't. But what we have seen is the thing I'm going to come to next. The terrorist arrest figures are released on a financial year basis. I don't know why that is. That tends to be how the government works. They come out every kind of April, May, they release last year's figures. So the latest ones we've got March 2021 to April, May this year. In that last year as such, there were 117 arrests for terrorism in the UK. Well, that doesn't sound much. Well, what that telling us? There's 2 people a week are being arrested in the UK for terrorism offences. Now, those arrests aren't made unless the police or the agencies feel there is a threat of some type. You know, it's not just done because people are saying, you know, they're online being a bit, although a lot of this is going online, but there is no threat. They're done because they feel if they don't arrest these people, there is going to be some form of action taken at some point, even if the threats and stuff are being discussed online. It's the serious end. You know, a counter-terrorism arrest isn't made unless it's been under the Act. Aren't made on the spur of the moment. Only if there's an emergency, i.e. somebody turns up at a sword, someone, they're arrested. Yeah, clearly those arrest them. But the vast majority of arrests are made following investigations before anything happens, you know. But those decisions are made after quite an in-depth investigation. And, you know, that if they're going to make an arrest using that power, they have to go to the CPS very often on a national basis to discuss, should we use this power? So it's not something that's just done. Normally there's several months of investigation, if not years, certainly if it involves online, where they will look and say, does this hit the terrorist profile? So 117 arrests, that's 2 a week. So just bear that in mind, because the security services, you know, the busiest they ever have been, they tell us. That means we in the prevent world are probably the busiest we've ever been. We're certainly as busy as I can remember over the last 10 to 15 years, probably busier. And I would suggest, again, partly because of the online world and that boost around COVID, conspiracy theories and people being online. But out of those 117, 20 of those arrests were for children. That figure shocked me. I mean, I've been working in this for a long time. So almost 20% of terrorist arrests in the UK were made of people 17 and under. Several of those 14 and 15. And tragically, I don't know if you saw it in the newspapers this weekend, I just caught it over Monday or Tuesday. One of the youngest of 14 and 15-year-old girls killed herself in care. When you look at some of the horrific issues around her lifestyle, so much going wrong, but she'd been arrested for terrorism offences. Now, those arrests, like I say, have to meet a real kind of strict, heightened parameters before they can go ahead. So that's 20 children. That doesn't cover all those young people we're working with Prevent and all those who aren't falling that. The vast majority of those are for their online activities. So clearly the police are doing a lot of work in the online world planning. But 19 out of those 20 arrests were for youngsters engaged around the extreme far right, white supremacism. So that's quite a horrifying figure. For me, I was shocked. You know, like I said, I've been working in this, and what it shows is, sadly, that the efforts of those extreme far-right organisations are putting into this idea of what they refer to as armies of one. They have been looking, in essence, of what Al-Qaeda and groups like that have done, saying globally go out and cause mayhem. There is what we refer to, and I know some of you, when we've done this training in the past, we've talked about the accelerationist movement. The idea that there is going to be an impending race or cultural war, we need to fight it now, will desensitise our young people and we'll send them out. The results of that are sadly very small in number, but there's a growing number, and we're seeing that. So that's 19 children in the UK arrested under counter-terrorism for the extreme far right. And just to reinforce that, like I say, counter-terrorism arrest, if on any of that, when they're talking, online and they're doing the work and they're planning, they mention weapons. The first thing, counter-terrorism arrest just doesn't occur with somebody knocking on the door saying to mum and dad, look, we need to take your 14 or 15-year-old down to the police station and have a chat. And the first thing, if there's mentions of weapons or anything like that, the first thing they'll know, and after a pre-planned operation, 6 o'clock in the morning, they'll wake up with armed police officers in their room because they'll just burst into the house. That's all the parents will know. That child will be taken away. It could be that the parents are taken and put in a hotel while the house is searched. It's a Rolls-Royce operation. They will look for anything electronic. It's a major statement if they've made that arrest. And we're seeing that happening. And like I said, it's happened, unfortunately, to the 17-year-old in Hertfordshire. The case we still refer to in the east of England is Matthew Cronaker, who was jailed in the middle of last year, arrested in the end of December 2020. So he was 17 when he was arrested. He'd been a child. This is, online though, he was talking about committing terrorist acts and horrifically how he was going to kill an ex-friend of his because the ex-friend is a different race, and he'd been drawn into this. He'd drawn up his hit list online. Matthew went to court middle of last year, never been in trouble, nothing to identify him in his life really, apart from one or two, when they look back, one or two comments he may have made, perhaps a couple of bits missed. Coming from a well-to-do family, and I hate that term, but that's how the media referred to, down at Chelmsford, neo-Nazi online, planning to kill, serving 12 years now as a convicted terrorist. What do we miss again? The same as the young lad for the Islamist. What drew him in? What have we missed? What has led that young person in his life to get that level of hate where he feels he needs to show this? I haven't seen, I've got to say, we see these terrorists. I haven't seen any of them appear on the James Bond movie. But these are the individuals who potentially are going to go out and kill somebody. These are the ones we need to be aware of. And they're people in our communities. They're the vulnerable amongst us. Is that, that's where the next terrorist will come from, sadly, if we don't keep an eye out. So we're seeing these continual arrests being made, sadly, which the positive, and it doesn't sound a positive though, is we are seeing more of these prevent referrals being made. Remember, every time there was a prevent referral, that's safeguarding, that's possibly stopped somebody being drawn into this. So when we repeatedly see anti-prevent propaganda about it trying to damage communities, what it's actually doing is safeguarding and stopping some very vulnerable individuals. And a lot of these individuals, when they start to do work, have a host of issues, as you know from some of your own experiences. It's stopping some of them from being drawn out, hopefully stopping them from being arrested, which is going to damage their lives and their families. Horrific impact on family and friends as well. More importantly, I suppose, stopping them from going out and harming others, because that's what we're trying to do. So each case that leads with prevent referrals, we're safeguarding and supporting somebody. We're drawing them away. We're not changing necessarily. We don't always, it's not about changing how they see the world. It's changing about how they deal with it and how they learn to react and live within that world. And that's the important part. It's challenging that ideology that violence is an acceptable aim. And that is the danger of some of these Islamists and the extreme far right white supremacists who will say to people, you want to change the world, violence is acceptable. And that's the danger sometimes when we see, certainly around the far right, groups like Patriotic Alternative and what we would refer to as white nationalists who will claim they don't use violence. They're not using violence, although there clearly are links between some of their members who are ex-National Action and things like this. But it's the same narrative, the issues they talk about. And it's a step away. Are they organisations which act as gateways, the same as other groups that, with strong theories for other kind of forms of radicalisation? Do they allow a gateway where some of those extremist groups say, look, we agree with what your group is saying, but actually we think we should use violence. Why didn't you come and talk to us? So that's why there's always these concerns where people bring up some of these discussions and narratives, and why we need to be confident to have some conversations around those narratives, possibly. If they're just students chatting and discussing, that's one thing. But if it appears that some of those messaging is getting harder, we don't, it is disturbing to what they would normally say. Yeah, we should be considering a prevent referral because we want to protect those vulnerable people. We want to stop this happening to them. That's what we're trying to do. So yeah, just to reinforce that, There's been a series of headlines you may have seen. The Guardian actually run a series of articles in August where I took these from, talking about the extreme far right and their targeting of young people. And you know, as educators, people working, this is our demographic. We will see people being radicalized across a wide range of ages, but there is an emphasis, and like I say, clearly a startling turn in a way, but young people are being targeted by these organisations, and they are being targeted. We know that, and we're seeing, to a degree, small but a significant increase. Because say that didn't used to work, so we know, but it works, and it's online where a lot of this occurs. Now, a lot of your students will spend what appears to many people an inordinate amount of time anyway online. We know that. It's the way of the world, But sometimes we just got to be looking out for those little signatures, those little telltale signs where they start to talk about issues in a manner which you think, well, that's not how they would normally. That's not how people would normally refer to that. Where are they listening to? Where are they getting this information? What is that discussion around that? Why have they started to other groups of people? Because as we know from prevent training in the past, if you're going to radicalise somebody, you've got to have another. It's that group over there which are the problem. And if you radicalise, it's a step then, you start to dehumanise. Well, if we get rid of them and that type of language, those, them, once you start to do that, once you start to ideate around that, the next step is, well, we can just do this to them. So young Ali Habdi Ali feels he can go and murder an MP. Matthew Cronica feels, yeah, I can murder my ex-friend because he is now another. And it's that type of language and type of concerns. Where do people, because they're not born with it, they're not, the society doesn't condone it. Where are they getting those views from? So just to add to that, just to reinforce, and I think we've mentioned some of these in the past now, but it is still a big issue. Actually, 50% of prevent referrals over the last couple of years have come in this mixed, unclear, moo. I'm hoping they change this, mixed, unclear, unstable. But this is one of the crux of the prevent review at the moment. Should prevent be focusing on the ideologies which we've just discussed, or similar ideologies, even if it's animal rights or whatever? People are causing an issue because of an ideology, they've stepped too far. Not saying, that, because remember, it's the step too far, not what they believe in. If they believe in violence, it's not necessarily their religion, political, philosophical, or even kind of belief around society. It's when they want to take that too far. Or should prevent cover all of these type of issues? Because as we've seen with mixed, unclear and unstable, and I think I've mentioned, we get a lot of prevent referrals now where actually an ideology can't always be identified, or they change. Mixed and unstable here, and I'm going to give you an example of an unclear one, which you may have covered, but just to reinforce it in a minute. Mixed and unclear, we're dealing with more and more people that when the referral is made by an education institute or the health service, a doctor, social worker, they say, look, we're really concerned about this person. They seem to have a grievance about society. They seem to be talking about a terrorist group or organisation, but actually they seem to be talking about several. So we've seen people who will talk about Al-Qaeda, but also they'll talk about Adolf Hitler. Sometimes there's a level, because there's links with anti-Semitism, but sometimes it's just because these groups use violence to further aims against groups they don't like. And unstables, we work with people who are almost changing their beliefs at several given time. But what always seems to underpin their beliefs is that they can use violence. So they will follow one type of group, then they'll look at another type of group. But what they like about these groups and individuals, in effect, is their use of violence. So we're finding people over the last few years with a personalised sense of grievance, almost looking to find something that they can peg that grievance in with that type of organisation, and then they've got another, and that group say you can use violence for that. And we're seeing more and more of that, like I say, 50% of referrals. But it's unclear what that ideology is. I've got to say, over the last decade or so, we've started to see a lot of these, and I think it's a good thing. But we're starting to identify a lot, and it could well be because we're doing better work. But sometimes when we identify them, we're spotting the wider range of safeguarding concerns or problems in these individuals' lives, their chaotic families, perhaps issues around broader mental health issues. And it's got to say, I think they're kind of saying 50 to 60% of channel referrals. I'm not sure quite figure, but quite a high figure of referrals into the channel mechanism appear to have not necessarily a mental health issue, but a wider range, a behavioural issue, something else Those issues weren't always discussed 5 or 6, certainly 10 years ago when we first started to prevent. So it could be that actually what we're doing is we're seeing, and it's a positive, it's a wider range. Now, whether the Home Office and other agencies recognise that and say, no, that shouldn't be in prevent, that person's, there is a concern, for example, that sometimes people or agencies are identifying a mental health issue and trying to push that into prevent because they know there is some support there and not always available, because we know, and you'll know better than I will, but unfortunately, the mental health services, certainly for young people, are under a lot of strain. And there is suggestion sometimes that people or agencies will try to get people into prevent because they feel that's a way of getting support, or that is a belief, one of the beliefs that part of the Home Office is saying, is this happening? So this is one of the things that's being kind of unpicked at the moment. I think what it's clearly doing is showing us that the vast majority of individuals who are prevent referrals, whatever their beliefs, have a wide range of issues. It's not just about logging onto a computer and saying, I support that. Why is that? Because very often there are issues in their lives, wider issues, which aren't always instantly identifiable. But that's what we should be looking at. And that's what channel panels do now. Back in the day, when I used to go to channel panels, each case or referral used to take about 15 minutes and you whip through them. They take a lot longer now because there's a wider range of agencies. And that is something, again, which we should find reassuring. Yourselves would be invited. That didn't always used to happen 10 years ago. If you had a referral, yourselves would be invited. Or and social services and other agencies spend far more time at channel panels. It's more protective. I'm hoping that the Prevent Review doesn't alter some of that, because it's bringing in some of these cases, where perhaps the prevent side isn't as big as some other parts, but it's part of it. And we need to look at people in a whole. It's a lot more holistic, I think, prevent than it used to be. So mixed and unstable, but I just want to highlight the unclear, just because I think we may have discussed this briefly, I'm not sure. But I just want to reinforce it because this is an example, just one example of things we find, and it is a product of the global world around the internet. What we see, incels, you're probably aware of incels. Is that a case of people just nod? I think most people are aware of what incels are now. Involuntary celibates, young men who can't form a sexual relationship, either through their view of themselves, the kind of physical attraction doesn't work, or and this I'll just cover it in a minute, it's a societal issue, and we'll cover that. And it was highlighted by the attack in Plymouth last year, where a person shot his mother and 5 others, I think shot 6 people before him shot himself, Jack Davidson. What was going on there on his social media, which after this horrific attack, the mainstream media found on his media mentioned the word incel, and straight away they referred to him as a terrorist incel, whether that's true or not. And there was a debate, and a very undignified debate, between the Home Office and the police at the time. Was this a terrorist attack? Because actually, incels aren't considered a terrorist organisation. Well, I've got to say, if I was living in Plymouth and 5 people have been shot in the street outside me, I think that's pretty much a terrorist attack. I can't think of what more is. It's probably the biggest terrorist attack for the last 5 years, at least in the UK. And there was a debate, a bit of an unseemly debate. But the issue around that is, we've looked at the issue, and these issues, if we'd identified this person earlier, that would have been a prevent issue. Now, incels, it was, as it says there, a new terror. It wasn't anything new. We know what incels, and those of you who have got a little awareness, if you can see the little pictures that I stole from the police there, it's a picture of a guy called Elliot Roger. Elliot Roger, late 2016, went out. He was an early YouTuber. But a young man in his early 20s, lived what a type of lifestyle in Southern California, which it would appear most young people, not young men, would aspire to, driving around in his soft top BMW, plenty of disposable income and all this, but he couldn't get a girlfriend. And it was biting into him. And clearly, when you look at someone, I'm not saying you should, because I don't know if they're still online, but I've seen some, got an extremely narcissistic young man. It would appear there were other issues around his mental health, who just, you can see getting angrier and angrier, till his last one, when he says, I've done a manifesto, I've posted it online, because there was an incel movement. I mean, I would suggest since the year dot, there's always been incels, young men who at certain stages of their lives are sexually frustrated. The vast majority just move on. But the internet allows them to go on the internet and somehow get trapped. They go into these groups, and they then form these groups online discussing, and it becomes just a soul searching amongst these groups of young men about how ugly they are, how the world is against them. He posted his manifesto online. He changed it. He decided that he was going to go out and do something about it. And that night he said, I'm going to go out and I'm going to go to a female sorority house and I'm going to kill as many as I can. If they won't go out of me, they're not going to go out of anybody. He stops on the way, gets involved in a conflict on the way, shoots 6 people before he shoots himself. He shoots himself, and then online a debate occurs within parts of the incel community around his manifesto. The vast majority of individuals shot don't agree with it. There's a small core who start to say, yeah, he is the incel angel, he is the supreme being. On some incel websites you will find him, you know, kind of religious iconography with pictures of his face on it as an angel and things. So this kind of level of misogyny clearly, which is, you know, we've seen in other forms of social media, haven't we? You know, it's kind of bled out into kind of this manosphere as well. So we know that it's there. It's been there for quite a while, but incels have started to see referrals now into Prevent of people who are clearly, and I'm thinking of one or somebody I was made aware of just over a month ago, a young man in his 19 and 20s. Yeah, hi, thanks, Dan. No problem. I can always catch up with you at some point. Thanks for letting us know. And the educational institution when he was at, and he was 18, 19. It was a kind of similar type. It wasn't in Bedfordshire, so I'm not giving too much. It was a similar type of organisation to yourselves, really, working with people outside the mainstream to a degree. The way he was just talking about his mother, it's totally dismissive. He's dismissive of then female teachers. He just didn't want anything to do with women. Actually, he couldn't understand why women are even allowed to be educated. He's a young man of 18, and they started to talk to him and prevent referring him because his view of the world is so warped, becomes so warped. We don't know. Probably it will be done online. So they're going to work with this young man, you know. So we've started to see these referrals around that. It's not a recognised ideology, but clearly this is a young person who, if left to his own devices, potentially could go out, because it's not just a little bit of misogyny. If you can get that, that's bad. You'd be working around that. But the Prevent referrals, there's the context, some of the kind of websites and things he'd indicated he'd been following. There's a broader context to it, just some of the comments he was going to be making. Okay, but I just want to reinforce that. But incels kind of give us a look about how simply these things work, because the incel community has kind of a pilling structure, or certain parts of it does, and it's a massive structure online. So I apologise because it is offensive and you know, unpleasant, but to discuss this, but we just need to break it down a little bit. So most of us here will be blue pillars, and we're ignorant of the real world of male oppression. I always feel a little bit uncomfortable to see the women thinking, what? But these people believe that actually the biggest group oppressed in the world are men. And that's it. And they believe this is something that's happened over the last 100 years, change the world, change how society structures, a global elite, and it's got a feminist, militant feminist agenda, is to subject all men to this. So straight away you can see those issues around misogyny, which even if they don't reach Prevent, could cause issues for you if you're safeguarding leads and educating people anyway. So that's one thing. The danger then is that there's what they call the red pill. Now, we're all used to the pilling. Following the film Matrix, you know, there's a pill and you take it, you see the world different. In their view, you take the red pill and you see this. And if you are wise enough, you know, you may be able to game the system. But this level of misogyny, you know, can carry on, problematic as it is. The danger for us, when it comes towards the Prevent world, is what they refer to as the black pill. And there's 2 levels of danger here, because the first issue we're talking about around safeguarding is we're dealing with young men, clearly in this case, who get to a stage where they just feel their life is futile. They're never going to get a girlfriend. Nothing's going to change. And there is a kind of element on these websites who say to them, well, just go and kill yourself then. You know, you're so ugly, nothing's going to change. That hits another safeguarding issue for us around male mental health, which has been discussed over the last 2 to 3 years, and the ability of young men sometimes to express themselves. So they can't seek support. They're online. They have friends who are telling them to go and harm themselves or to get rid of themselves. You know, so that there is an issue around that. The other part where it becomes even more, well, the Prevent element around the safeguarding is there is a belief within certain core groups or some incels, but this isn't about looks. This is this societal issue. And if you're going to change it, you should do, as they refer to in Eliot, we should fight back. And we see individuals kind of identified as that. You know, and that is the danger But they will say to them, look, society is causing this. Why didn't you fight? They're radicalised, they're groomed. Sadly, 51% of the population are female are made the other. Target them, take your frustration out and any man that gets in the way. And we've seen in America examples of that. And we've started to see a couple of cases in the UK where it has gone to court. There was one in Scotland, so it didn't get so much attention, but there was a young man called Gabriel Friel, very troubled young man, only 20, I think 18, 19 when he went to court. So a lot of support. He'd been involved in a violent incident and he stabbed a police officer, but they put that down to mental health. And he was in the community, people working with him. One day he says to a social worker, one of his care workers, that he's following Elliot Rodgers. And actually, I think he's right. Now, she didn't know who Elliot Rodgers was, but she went away and done her work and looked and thought, oh, crikey, we've got a young man who's unfortunately committed an act of violence. And he's saying he believes this person who is encouraging others to go and do this. So they start to look into him and they find he's storing weapons. And he ends up going to court because they believe that he would have gone out and committed these attacks. And that was all from the things he was doing online, because this is an online movement. So that would be what we call mixed unclear. That isn't recognisable as a terrorist organisation, but we're seeing more and more of these type of cases where people will latch onto something in their lives, in this case, around their ability to form a relationship, even, you know, something as kind of basic and as simple as that, and make a cause of it where they could drift into this, where it becomes something, but that act, their grievance could be drawn into committing an act of violence. So we've started to see that. The similar one is what we call, certainly a concern for the education sector, is what we call school shootings, and we've dealt, and we teach one day, you've got a very troubled young man, chaotic family background, mental health issues, physical health issues, learning issues, getting a lot of support, just turns around to one of his teachers one day in a one-to-one and says, I've been looking at the Columbine school massacre. And she said, well, why? Because he said, if I could get a gun, there are some days I could walk into this school and do that. Now, there's a horrific risk factor. You know, if one of your students said to you, I could come in here one day and just stab people, I'm sorry, clearly there's risk. You know, and that would have to be looked. But clearly, what is it in this young person's life that's making him think like that? And what is he looking at saying that's okay? Where can we work? And this young man, clearly a long way, fortunately, just kind of said that. And they're working with him. They're going to support him. That's another thing, they will work with him on that. Oh, but it also made them aware of the potential risk, how they're going to work with him in the future. So that's not, you know, was he ever going to be a terrorist? Hopefully not. But he might have gone out and done something fairly horrific, even if he just harmed one person or harmed himself. So we need to be aware. So those are those safeguarding mechanisms. I know you've got your safeguarding protocols. They're up and running. And I hope from what we've said, look, we're looking there to protect vulnerable members of our community. That's what it's about. And hopefully we've reinforced that today. Going to finish on this slide. As you can see, it's taken from an American news article about teen terrorism, because they've identified the problem in America late last year, and they've been discussing it. But I use that picture. I like that picture because when people say to me, you know, what does a terrorist look like? I don't know, but I would suggest the vast majority of terrorists from our communities, because that's when it comes, start off looking something like that. That picture's nice anonymised, isn't it? Be any race, the person could be any religion. It looks young, but it could be older. It's just an anonymised picture of somebody sitting there with a blanket over the head, that symbology of covering up, being in the dark on their own online, and they're just typing in something. They could just be on Facebook or even something like that on Twitter, just saying, I think this is right. The danger is something pings, said, I just like your comment. Why didn't you come and talk to us over here? Why didn't you go onto this encrypted program? Actually, you're right, but you've got friends. We all know, and without going into the dangers of all this, if you are that young person, you feel insignificant and somebody says you are right, you mean something, we are your friends, we can make you something. Because there's always a danger, and incels, I'm going to leave a message, I'm going to be remembered. If somebody is telling that young vulnerable person, you are important to us, come and talk to us. Don't tell your family, come and talk to us. Your family don't know, your family don't care. Your old friends, well, I haven't got any friends now. Well, we are your friends. How dangerous is that? at times to some young people. So I don't know what terrorists look like. I suggest that's where the vast majority, they don't come from bomb films, they come from vulnerable, scared individuals in our communities who somebody says, you mean something to us. And we know the power, there can be some excitement, but just that allure, what, somebody likes me, somebody agrees with me. Yeah, that's where the next terrorist will come from. You know, forget Blofeld. Look at the young individuals we're working through. That's it. Got a couple of minutes for questions. I'm sure I've kind of made everybody gloomy on this Tuesday morning in Bedfordshire. I apologise for that. I'm hoping, Danny, that's a reminder of why we're doing this and what we're doing and what the threats. I hope that was useful for you and you've recorded it. But folks, any questions or thoughts? Any feedback? Because like I say, doing it online, it's always good to get some feedback. I'm not after necessarily good. Was that useful for you? It's good to know because this is the thing I'm using. Emma, go ahead.
Hi. So whereabouts does groups such as like the Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, like where do they come into this? Is that something that we should also be challenging and being aware of?
Right. I've got to be very careful as I say this as a civil servant, because it's important that groups. We live in a democratic society, and the right to kind of protest is enshrined in law, isn't it? You know, people have got the right to protest, and environmental groups, probably the vast majority would agree with a lot of their aims. That's about protest. So if you've got somebody who's supporting those organisations, yeah, just discuss and support them perhaps, or whatever. Where it changes is what people are going to do. Okay, now if somebody's going to glue themselves, and you know there's a lot of this type of protest, that's not a prevent issue, because they're not using a sense of violence to further their aim. They are committing criminal offences. And actually, that is more of, if you've got groups and you're having those discussions about, is it right, you know, to damage a work of art or this, that's a discussion about the right to protest and how far that should go. And I would suggest actually, well, some of those discussions can also start to talk, look, if you ever get arrested for these could have damaging impacts. If you've got people who want to work in healthcare, become tutors or teachers, and they get arrested for something, and it's a hard argument because these people passionately believe in that, probably the person who's going to suffer most for it in their life is potentially them, because it could have quite ramifications. And also the discussions around, well, how do you protest? Is that right? But they're not prevent issues. They would become prevent issues if somebody says, I'm just going to, that MP who says that, I think they should be killed because they don't stop oil. That would be concerning, because what we're looking at is about somebody saying, I'm going to use violence to further that aim. So you've got to remember, when people are arrested for terrorism, it's about what they're going to do, their actions. It's not about supporting the cause. I use that old cliche, you know, about a united Ireland. You've got MPs who support a united Ireland. Sinn Féin, that's perfectly legal. You've got people who support the IRA going to use violence. They're the terrorists, because it's use of that, you know, and I use that because you've got sitting MPs. I'm not making a judgment on that. I'm just saying, it's not the cause, so nobody's going to make a cause and judgment, and certainly groups like Extinction Rebellion, people belonging to that, supporting Stop Oil, they are not prevent referrals. There are discussions you can have about the right to protest, and can be some interesting discussions around those beliefs, but in and of itself, no, they're not prevent related, unless you suddenly think they're going to go out and really harm somebody for that cause. Does that help? Has that kind of answered that?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I need to point out, because there was a mistake. You may have, about 2 years ago, I think, one police area, not in the east, made a mistake of saying, well, do we need to look at Extinction Rebellion, and caused a right hoo-ha. Quite rightly so. You know, they are not terrorists. They're protesters. We may or may not agree with them, but they should be dealt with as that. And those discussions talk about their rights and protest. I know, and somebody, you know, people might be thinking, well, this government are bringing in new legislation. I can't help that. You know, I don't know, and I've got views on that myself. But in and of itself, it's not a prevent issue. Any other question, folks?
David, it's Danny. Thanks ever so much, as always, for the kind of detailed and factual insight. I think it just brings home the importance that we do this at least annually, just to kind of bring it to the forefront, because having had your company for several years now, it just seems to be getting younger and younger with the audience that is targeted. So it very clearly cements it in our camp, where we are dealing with a large majority of vulnerable young people, young adults, vulnerable adults. Society that they find themselves in now is very disruptive, seemingly negative every which way that you look, and I think it's human nature to look for a blame, and I think it's for everybody on this call to keep doing what we do, which is openly debate and discuss and provide facts and almost fact check. So I've just got a very quick couple of questions. One, would you have, and not to put you on the spot, would you be able to help and supply us with a robust kind of fact checking, because we want to make sure that we are supporting especially our young people around fake news, conspiracy theories, things like that. Have you, in the industry, in your profession, got anything you could endorse, or you could maybe speak to me in the next couple of weeks around?
Have a look, Danny, to your next question. Have a look at Educate Against Hate. I know it's the government website, and I think there are some resource packs. I know they may be school orientated, but they can be adapted. Well, I think they cover some of those issues. Have a look at that first.
Yeah.
Because that's where we at the DFE always start from there. If you don't find that, let me know. Just email me and say, is there anything else? I will have a look. The trouble is, when you start to talk about internet safety, which is that kind of broad term, it's very hard because it's just such a wide thing. But I would start off looking there, and I'll mention it to some colleagues to see if there's anything else going on, and come back to you in the meantime.
No, that's great. Thank you. And then finally, second question, we did some discussion work as a team yesterday around British values and around that kind of focused language and what falls within that. Do you see that staying quite tight with the prevent agenda moving forward, or are we kind of moving away from that slightly because of the language?
No, I think it will stay like that for the time being. And I think if there's any change, there will be some guidance and things issued. Certainly, I haven't heard anything. As I say, there's a lot of uncertainty about how prevent works, but I haven't heard. And if it does, there may be some changes. But at the moment, I would carry on. It is as it is, and certainly Ofsted would carry on looking at as it is, because there's nothing to change that guidance at the moment.
Lovely, thank you. Is there anybody else who wants to ask any questions or drop one in the chat box? No? Okay, brilliant. I'll stop recording now then. Again, thank you,